And we're back. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it may be, wherever you is. I is here in California, and it's 8 days this time since we last got together, since we went a day early last week because of daylight savings time and birthdays and all kinds of stuff like that. So hope you are well. And we are all still well here. We are just doing our thing and hanging out and staying out of trouble and, all the good stuff. So I thought I'd check in with people first just to say hello to everybody and see who's here. Ronnie's here. Hello, Ronnie. Good to see you. Mihai, lovely to see you too. Chris, good morning from Lübeck. Thank you. Nice shirt. Yes, this is one of my birthday shirts. My "If You've Got Lemons, Make Lemonade" shirt. Hola, Jeremy. Good morning, Rosalba. Oh, from Milan. I didn't know you were in Milano. Never been there. That's one of the few big Italian cities I haven't visited yet, although I've heard it's a wonderful place. And there is my beautiful sister-in-law, Lisa. Good morning, Lisa. Hope things are going well for you. Hope the weather is changing. And my gorgeous mother-in-law, Hazel. Good morning. Lovely to see you too. And again, I hope things are going well. I get all the news from Deb, so I'm semi up on what's going on in Aldridge, which, by the way, is where my wife's family lives. Aldridge in the West Midlands. Nice place, nice people. Yes, Hazel, your daughter gave me the shirt. Of course, of course. I can't say for certain if there was any intention behind giving me a shirt covered with lemons. Since I'm the only guy she ever married, I hope I'm not a lemon. But anyway, but I'm rather fond of the shirt. Yes, it's very nice, and I couldn't wait to debut it on this morning's, whatever you want to call it, reading. Julian, or Julian, if you're checking in from Kassel. Hello, Kassel. Good to see you again. Haven't been there for a while, but I intend to get back soon since we have good friends there. Felina, I'm doing fine. You got rain and snow, huh? Yeeks. The first day of spring. Not my idea of a good time. Good morning, Christine. Christine likes the shirt too. And thank you. And Angela, good morning from the New Forest. Yes, I know. I'm very pleased with the shirt. This is the only one I think that's got like patterns on it. Everything else Deb got me were my usual solid colors and a replacement for my completely ancient and tattered Jimi Hendrix t-shirt, which we got, Lord God, it must be like 15 years ago now at the Rock and Roll Museum in Seattle. Because, of course, I am a big Hendrix guy. I was probably like the only person, certainly the only person in my grade in my junior high school that was devastated when Jimi Hendrix died, because I was already a huge fan. Anyway, sorry, I'm not going to get off into all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I got a new Hendrix shirt, I got a lemon shirt, and then I got a bunch of really nice shirts in solid colors, and a huge black poodle shirt. Which it doesn't have a poodle on it. It's just all woolly and poodly. It's really cool. I was going to wear it tonight, but you can't really see it on a camera and can't see how cool it is, and especially how woolly, fuzzy, woolly it is. It's very squishy, and I don't know. It's just a cool shirt. Anyway, so I am not going to take a super long time tonight talking, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish War of the Flowers. Lord of the Flowers. I'm going to finish War of the Flowers. I'm going to go back and read a little bit of the last section that I was kind of maybe speeding through a little bit, at least by my standards. And I'm going to try and finish it up, and then I'm going to give the folks tomorrow the option of either hearing it again, since it is the end of the story, or if they so desire, I'll read something else instead. So, and of course, those of you who are not going to be able to listen to that broadcast live or see that broadcast live can see it in reruns. Does that word even exist anymore? Hi, Sally. Nice to have you here. Does that word even exist anymore, or is that like a completely I'm a trapped in the 1970s kind of thing? Because when broadcast TV hardly exists anymore, how can you have reruns? But I guess they don't call them that. They're classics now or something. Anyway, so I'm going to jump in and start reading the end of War of the Flowers, and I'm going to start with, I'm going to start with the end of the last chapter, because the end of the previous chapter, because then the last chapter is quite short. So I'm just going to jump in, and we're going to go back to Theo's meeting with Mudbug Button, which is about, actually, that's quite a few pages. Maybe I should not go all the way back to there. All right, so I'm going to skip up to here, and I'm going to read this last section, and then I'm going to go on to the final chapter. So the name of this chapter, since I'm skipping partway through it, was Farewell Feast, chapter 42. And this is Theo. The war is now over. The good guys have won, albeit with a great deal of craziness going on. And Theo is going to go meet Mudbug Button, who has specially asked for Theo to join him for a meal. And they're back at the bridge, back where the sort of revolutionary camp was located. He had expected to be met at the top of the stairs by Button's ogre bodyguards, but there was no sign of them. He was met instead by a trio of goblins he didn't recognize, all dressed in loose, colorful clothing, with knives stuck in their belts, and various lines painted or tattooed on their faces. They did not seem delighted to see him, but there was no hostility either. They bowed in a stiffly formal way, arms at their sides, and then led him into Button's apartment. A group of goblin musicians sat cross-legged in one corner, playing a soft but angular melody. And for a moment, Theo was thrown back into that hour when the music was all that had saved him. Might it have saved more than that? Could goblin jazz have spared the entire mortal world from ruin? What a concept, he thought. An overblown rock opera if ever there was one. One of the instrumentalists nodded as Theo passed. It was Bottlecap, with whom he had shared a night of music and ghostweed, but the hush of the room and the air of ceremony kept him from stopping to converse. Still, Theo thought, it would be interesting to talk to him about what had happened on the little island, even to try to work out in actual music some of what he had experienced. Maybe someday? Yeah, but I'll be going home, he thought, so that won't happen. Theo had also anticipated that Primrose and some of Button's other closest confidants would be there, but other than himself there were only goblins. He saw Doorlatch and a few others that he recognized from the camp, but there were far more unfamiliar faces, serious, wild-looking goblins in festival colors, many of them armed. At the center of the room, in front of a carpet laid with dishes and tea bowls, sat Mudbug Button. He was dressed in white, as Theo was. He looked like an Indian holy man holding court in his ashram. He stood as Theo approached, reaching out to him with a taloned hand. "Welcome, Theo Vilmos. It is good of you to come. I had feared you would not be well enough, and this would be a poor farewell feast without the most important guest. But, well, to be honest, I'm not 100% certain I'm going back." "Ah." Button sat down and directed one of the goblins next to him to pour tea for Theo. The person in question looked more like a warrior than a servant, but he did as he was asked. When Theo had taken a few sips for courtesy's sake, and allowed his dish to be piled with various savories, he had a quick, if covert look to make sure none of them were field mouse based, he leaned forward. "Where are Primrose and the others?" "Caradinus is in mourning," Button explained. "He begged to be excused." "He must have loved his sister very much." Button looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, he did." Theo said, "I'm amazed to be alive. I'm surprised so many of us are. Did you know it would work this way?" For the first time, Button showed a little of his old sly self. "If I told you I did, would you promise to tell that story to all who ask you?" Then history will remember me as a genius of tactics, another Lord Rose. But to be truthful, no. I hoped. Primrose and I made the best plan we could. We knew the goblins would fight after the stick was broken, that my people's anger was too hot to be contained once the treaty was ended. But did we know for certain that others would come out? That the streets would be full of discontent and rage? No, we could only do what was best and hope. But you did know that Grimms could kill dragons. Again, Button smiled. I knew that they could, yes, but even that was what might be called a gamble. And everyone knows that although we goblins love gambling, we are not always good at it. He turned to the goblin on his left, whose costume bristled with feathers and beadwork jewelry. Otter, when you lived in the hills, you killed a dragon, yes? The goblin looked at Theo, then rubbed his long nose. Yes, my people called me Worm Slayer. How big was it? Button asked. The one called Otter thought for a moment, then spread his arms wide. Wings like this, he said. One of the big ones. He went back to his solemn chewing. That would mean Otter's famous trophy was about 10 or 12 feet long. Button laughed. So, you see, even the Grimms had little experience with the great worms. Again, we could only hope that arrows steeped in poison in their eyes and soft throats would have the same effect that they did on the monster's much smaller cousins. My God, they were trying that for the first time? War is often that way, said Button. Now eat. I would ask you more questions about what you heard and saw, and what happened to you, particularly of the remover. The little I've heard is very surprising. But you're not eating. I am fasting, the goblin explained. But the food is very good. Eat. You have been a long time asleep, and I think you need it. Theo really was very hungry, and although many of the tastes were unfamiliar, the food was good. As he answered Button's questions, struggling to remember the order in which things had happened, having to backtrack several times when he realized he had left out an important detail, he realized that goblin food and goblin music, just to name two unquestionably foreign things, were beginning to seem almost ordinary to him. So you yourself were the key, Button said at last. Just a tool. No, that was Hellebor's great error. He thought of you that way, but it was your mind and your heart that broke him. Now I will ask you a question, just as you asked me. Did you know that the Ira would take the child if it could not take you? Theo shrugged. Like you said yourself, I hoped. I didn't have much time to think about it, really. I just remembered Dowd saying something about how a changeling and the mortal child he gets switched with have some kind of bond. I didn't really understand it, but there weren't a lot of other options. Also, I suddenly realized that I'd rather have one of those water women get me than that thing. It would have been a quick death by fire or a slow death beneath the water, Button said thoughtfully. They say that those taken by water spirits come to love their captors before they die. He went silent for a moment and then shook his head. There has been too much talk about death. Tell me more about your world. This is a feast, after all. I have been too much in the company of my own people lately, however much I love them. Tell me tales of your world, which has so recently escaped a terrible fate that it likely did not even know existed. I hope so. I'd hate to go back and find myself in the middle of the new Dark Ages or something. Theo paused. Just One more question for you, if you don't mind. Something I still don't understand. You said the goblins were ready to fight back, and it seems like the only thing keeping them under the thumb of those flower lords was the treaty stick. Why hadn't anyone broken it before? Why were you the first? Button gave him a quizzical look. Do you really want another goblin tale? Very well. I cannot refuse you tonight. I will try to make it a swift one. The answer is deceptively simple, Theo. First of all, most goblins did not know where the stick was kept. We supposed it would be hidden in some deep and well-guarded vault. It did not occur to us that the flower lords knew so little about us or cared so little for the danger we posed to them, that they did not understand only our sacred word bound us to them, our ancestors' promise in the form of the treaty stick. Primrose himself told me where it was. It was merely a curiosity to him, something he had stumbled across in the dusty back rooms of the Parliamentary Museum as he pursued his studies in justice and history. When he mentioned it to me, years after he had seen it, I realized exactly what it was and began to plan. But somebody must have known. There must have been goblin janitors or somebody. Why didn't anyone ever take it before? Why were you the one who broke it? Button was silent for a moment. I suppose it is a bit shameful, in a way, that no one before me dared to do this thing. Yes, there may have been some that knew, but it was also true that no one wanted to face the death that would result from breaking that treaty. Theo didn't understand. The goblins seemed a bit more gung-ho than that. It was hard to imagine them enduring servitude merely out of fear that many of them would die in a rebellion. He would never forget the wild warriors he had seen in Strawflower Square, calmly stringing their bows as the flailing black shadows came down on them from the sky. Enough of this, Button said suddenly. I invoke my privilege as guest of honor. Tell me tales of your world, Theo. Tell me of your life. Make me laugh. I'll do my best. He shrugged off the thoughts of war and worms, tried to think of the things he missed about the world to which it seemed he would soon be returning. He wondered if Button would understand why Johnny Battistini, trying to parallel park a stolen ice cream wagon while ripped out of his mind on mushrooms, was funny. He told him the story. Button understood, or seemed to. It was nearly midnight when he finally got up to say goodbye. Button also rose and hugged him, a strange, wiry embrace that was not quite like anything Theo had experienced. I will miss you, Theo. It has been good to know you. Well, don't change my address in your Rolodex quite yet. I'm still thinking it over. Ah. Button took his hand for a moment, fixed him with those slotted yellow eyes. I feel sure that whatever you do, you will take a little goblin music with you always. He let go of Theo's hand. Go safely, Theo Vilmos. I like that better than what you said to me the last time we were together. What was that? Something like, we aren't promised anything but the last breath we took? Something like that. Yes. Good night. No one was waiting for him outside the bridge house. Cumber and Applecore long since gone off to bed. And that was a personal arrangement Theo still hadn't completely wrapped his head around. But there were enough fires and torches burning in the riverside camp, not to mention the flaring stars, to make finding his way back easy. Something nagged at him as he walked, something about the way Button had spoken, the things he had said. On any other such night, Theo would have let it go, but he was stone sober, having drunk nothing but goblin tea, and it was either that or think about his own, still very muddled plans. I'm not immortal, but I think like one. So where do I belong? And if I don't go home to the mortal world, will they take back the farewell feast? He was full of questions and found himself almost nostalgic for the old days, for the happy ignorance of going home blasted and blank. Here's another one. Why did Button throw a farewell get-together for me and invite a bunch of wild goblins I don't know? Perhaps it was only the goblin's odd, semi-formal way of speaking, but the theme had come up several times, including Button ending the conversation about the breaking of the treaty stick by invoking his privilege as guest of honor. But if it's a farewell feast for me, Theo thought, wouldn't I be the guest of honor? And then it suddenly clicked. The whole strange way that things had gone. Everyone's reticence and odd remarks. It was a goblin story about the stick. He told me so, and they always have a hole in the middle. Button had said it himself, but Theo hadn't recognized it. No one wanted to face the death that would result from breaking that treaty. Those had been his exact words. Theo had assumed he meant the death of Button's fellow goblins in a rebellion, but he had been talking about himself. Those white robes, he hadn't been a holy man surrounded by acolytes, but a condemned prisoner, however respected, surrounded by his jailers, by his executioners. Theo ran back across the camp as fast as he could, but the bridge house was locked, the upper windows dark. He hammered his fists on the door, but no one answered. At last, old Doorlatch came out of one of the other buildings on the ramshackle bridge, wiping his eyes. Whether because he had been asleep or crying, Theo couldn't tell. When he at last understood Theo's heartbroken ramblings, he tried to lead him back to his tent. "There is nothing you can do," the goblin said. "Nothing. It is the law. Button knew that. He did what was best. He shall remain in us always. A great hero." Theo would not be comforted by this and would not go away quietly. It seemed like he had been tricked, although if anyone had fooled him, he had fooled himself. He felt cheated of a final chance to say goodbye. Doorlatch had to summon half a dozen helpers, goblins and fairy folk, and one ogre bodyguard that Theo didn't recognize, to carry him back forcibly to his tent and Poppy. The only thing he could think about, the only thing that made the pain the tiniest bit less agonizing, was that perhaps it had been easier for Button this way. One less weeping farewell, one less time having to listen to someone demanding the impossible. Poppy, the child of a cold culture and a cruel family, did not try to make things better. Poison was poison, she seemed to know, and had to be sweated out. She held Theo while he wept and groaned and shouted, and kept on holding him until, exhausted, he was taken by sleep at last. Going to run out of story pretty early tonight. 43, Chapter 43, The Limits of Magic. At the first light of morning, Theo went to Caradinus Primrose, who invited him into his tent, which seemed to be both more sumptuous and more sparse than Theo's own, or any of the other riverside dwellings he had seen. The simple life seemed to agree with flower folk. Like Button, Primrose could make a carpet seem like a throne. He listened to Theo's impassioned plea for long minutes, but at last put up a long-fingered hand to stop him. "You must listen, Theo Vilmos, please. We owe you much. But nobody owes you this. And even were it possible, I could not grant it. I have not the power. I have no power any more, at least not the sort that comes with privilege and birth. That may return. We flower families still have many resources, and I do not think the world will be so completely topsy-turvy as some believe. But even if I did, I would not have stepped in and tried to change things. Button chose this path, knowing all along what would happen to him, whether after victory or defeat. It was his will and his wish. Primrose lowered his eyes for a moment. But most of all, Theo, it is already too late. He is dead. The council of his tribesmen put him to death last night. For long moments Theo could only sit, wiping tears from eyes that were already sore with weeping, trying to keep from losing his wits entirely. He said you were in mourning, Theo managed at last. I thought he meant for your sister. For her, too. But she has been lost to me a long time. Button was my brother, although we were from different worlds and peoples. He was my friend. Theo looked up at Primrose's stiff, expressionless face. The mask of the flower nobility, he had learned, was not always effective. He said once that the two of you weren't friends, that you couldn't be, that you were too different. Primrose actually laughed, but it was a sound with a great deal of pain in it. Then it only proves that the goblin was not as wise as he usually appeared. Theo dried his eyes with his sleeve. He felt empty, except for the ache in his chest. I don't think I like this world anymore. Can I really go home? Does the magic, the science, still work? Primrose thought for a moment. I know of no reason why you cannot go back to your world, now that you need no longer fear the undead spirit that pursued you. Any reasonably practiced person can open a gateway for you to use. It is not the power of the generating plants that is needed for that, since no one will be trying to hide the gateway, as they did when you were brought here, but the power that each of us in Fairy contain in ourselves. With a little study, I do not doubt you could do it yourself. He brought his hands together in his lap. We will miss you, Theo. If you go, you will not be able to return. Not until such a time as we can undo the clover effect, which was a work of great craft performed in an era when power was more freely available. To be honest, right now I don't care about returning. But he did care about Poppy, he suddenly realized. He needed her to go with him, or it would be all meaningless. What use the memories of heroism, of life and death decisions, of beauty and horror, if he left behind the only truly good thing that had happened to him? He would turn into Eamon Dowd, sour and bitter and maybe even driven mad by what he had lost. I'll leave you alone now. I have to go talk to someone. Then go in peace, Theo Vilmos. You too. He reached the door of the tent and looked out for a moment at the morning of a day that showed something of the stunning loveliness Fairy could produce. Even the distant city skyline seemed to him again, as it once had, a wondrous, supernatural thing. The tips of the towers, not skyscrapers, but minarets, elfin castles. He turned back to Primrose. Will you make things better this time? Here, I mean, in this new age you're starting? Caradonus Primrose did not quite manage a smile. I hope so. We can only try. Yeah. He lifted a hand, suddenly feeling awkward. Take it easy. He had only gone 100 paces or so when a ferryman he did not recognize emerged from the crowd of passers-by and fell into step beside him. The newcomer was dark-haired and of the same human type as the flower lords, but otherwise undistinguished. He kept his eyes down as he walked. I wanted to say goodbye, the stranger said, and that I am sorry. I have done terrible things. I have much to think about. Theo shook his head. Why did everyone know so much about his business? I'm sorry, do I know you? The stranger smiled, still without looking Theo in the face. He had his shoulders hunched as though he didn't want anyone to notice him, which was odd because he was already almost completely unremarkable. You turned out to be quite clever, really. I admired what you did with the water nymph. I don't think that was all just your true heritage coming out, either. There's something to be said for a mortal upbringing, after all. I'm beginning to think we're tougher than the fairies, in some ways. Are you called Theo Violet now, by the way? Wait a second. Who are you? He grabbed the man by the shoulder, spun him around. The man looked back at him, but even face to face he was still unfamiliar. The stranger's posture was that of someone ready to run away, but a sly little smile flickered around the edges of his mouth. You haven't figured it out yet. Maybe I've given you too much credit. Dowd? It seemed impossible, but suddenly he could hear the suggestion of that soft, strained voice coming from this far more ordinary throat. But you're dead! I saw you die! Come, Theo. That could have been a speech out of a Flash Gordon comic. You saw that body die. It's happened to me once before, as you know, and I survived it. Since then, I've spent years trying to strengthen myself so I could eventually get into another less unpleasant body than the removers. As it turned out, I needed every moment of that practice. He held out his arms like someone who had just performed an impressive conjuring trick, which, obviously, he had. As my body died, I took refuge in one of Hellebor's guards. He wasn't a particularly nice man, but I'm still not proud of forcing him out of his own flesh. The body and I were captured on the hilltop after Hellebor and the terrible child died. We were running away, of course, but we were let go after a few days. This fellow's been officially rehabilitated, you see, so I'm in the clear. There's no real guilt attached to being a foot soldier in the losing army, or even one of Nidris Hellebor's private guard. So, here I am. I think I'll head out to Ash or Birch. Start over. Arafine is dead now. Really dead. I have much to think about. I should turn you over to Karatanus Primrose. He's just back there. Or kill you myself. Theo fought the overwhelming sense of unreality. This was the second time he had spoken with Eamon Dowd, and both times it was after discovering the man was alive beyond all logic. You helped to kill our baby, me and Kat. There is nothing I can say except that I am sorry. Yes, I assisted Hellebor in delivering the spell. It was a madness that affected all I did, my desperate love and my anger at having been cheated. I think it has passed now. I certainly feel I see things more clearly, but perhaps that is just the effect of having a new body. I still can't let you walk away. Yes, you can. And in fact, you will. Because if you don't, I'll be forced to take someone else's body to escape. Not yours, but some innocent's. You won't stop me no matter what you do. I will leap from body to body if I need to, and many will die needlessly." Theo stared at the stranger's face. He felt weary and sick. "So I have to let you go." "Yes, you do. In fact, I'm going now." The dark-haired fairy turned and walked away down a narrow street between rows of ramshackle dwellings, tents, and lean-tos, a small thoroughfare crowded with fairy folk of all shapes and sorts, talking, trading, living their lives. Within moments, Eamon Dowd was lost from sight among all the other refugees. Poppy wasn't at the tent when Theo got back. He had been full of useful arguments, scads of convincing reasons why she should come back with him to the mortal world. But he suddenly found himself with nothing much to say and no one to say it to. In fact, he was stunned. Things had become altogether too strange. Dowd was dead, but had come back. Mudbug Button was dead, and wasn't going to come back. There lay the unfairness of life in a single nutshell, and it went pretty much the same way in fairy as it did in the mortal world. There's not much difference between the two when it comes to the important stuff, he thought. Not really. He sat for a long while in the doorway, staring out at the clouds and the play of light in the sky, listening to the racket of the camp's daily life. There seemed to be more children around than before, or at least they were being allowed to make more noise. Children always sound the same, he thought, no matter where they come from, what languages they speak, whether they have fox ears or yellow goat eyes or whatever. They always sound the same. It was a nice sound, he realized. "Goodbye, Button," he thought. "I guess this is your epitaph. The sound of children playing. Goblin children, fairy children. There are worse things to leave behind." Someone made a small sound, and he looked up to find 3 faces looking down at him, one from a very great height. It was the nearest face that startled him, the goblin face, since he had been thinking of Button, but he hadn't seen any of them since he had returned from the lake bottom, and it took him a fraction of a moment to put names back on the familiar expressions. "Streety Nettle! And Mistress Twinge, and Coathook, too. How are you all?" The tall, shock-haired fairy did not look any better connected to reality than he had been before the downfall of the old order, but at least he looked calm and happy. He extended a long-fingered hand to help Theo up. "Hello, Theo," he said, and his cheeks colored. "Poppy's here. Not just in my head, but she's here. Every day." "I know. It's good to see you, Streety." "She's nice." "Yes, she is." He turned to the others. "So we all survived, huh?" "More or less," said the Pooka, then leaned toward him and lowered her voice. "Although Edie Stray here doesn't know about Utton Bay just yet, if you get what I mean. So watch what you say. It's going to upset him, and we want to have a wire around his ankle when he finds out, so he's grounded and he doesn't set the whole camp on fire or turn us all into butterflies or something." She straightened up again. "Anyway, Coathook had something he needed to talk to you about, and me and Streety thought we'd tag along and say hello. So, how's it hanging, roommate? I hear you've been pretty busy." Theo shrugged. "Not by choice. Actually, almost none of it was by choice. Even so, the grapevine says you met the big guy himself." "Big guy?" For a moment he thought of Button, small, slender Button, handing him that card at the bus stop, and had to swallow hard. Sorry, who would that be? Mistress Twinge took a moment to reply, applying a flame from her fingertip to an ugly turd-colored cigar. The big guy, she said through a cloud of foul smoke. Robin Goodfella, of course. He's pretty much the hero of my folk. The king's right-hand man, he used to be. Most famous puka that ever lived. What was he like? Theo tried to remember, but much had happened since those moments on the black boat. Sad, wise, I guess, as far as I could tell. Kind of funny, too. He didn't like Hellebore much. Mistress Twinge nodded happily. A man of the people. I wonder where he is. Nobody knows. The puka didn't seem much worried. Now that Hellebore and the rest are gone, the binding spells are gone too. He's probably sailing around with the king and queen or something, getting a little well-earned rest. You think they're all still alive? The puka leaned forward, bringing a fog of tobacco fumes with her that would make a hyena squint. Of course they are. You don't kill off any of those folks. They're like the stars, the moon, like taxes. She stood up and gave Theo a hearty slap on the back that nearly dislocated his scapula. We gotta get going now. Come on, Streety, let's go make some of them new arrivals nervous. Theo, sorry to hear you're leaving, fella. I was going to teach you how to play beetle bout for money, which would be a comfort to you in your declining years. Coathook sat silently until Mistress Twinge had vanished, whistling down the muddy streets between the rows of tents. Streety nettled, tagging along after her like a stork following a bulldog pup it had misidentified as its mother. The goblin blinked, then looked at Theo almost shyly. You saw him last night. What was he like? It took a few seconds for Theo to understand, and understanding brought back pain. I'm not sure I want to talk about it right now. Coathook's clawed fingers closed on his arm, gently, but with enough force to tell Theo he didn't want the goblin ever to grab him for real. Please. He thought of this small fellow writhing on the floor of Elysium House, having taken real poison to facilitate Button's desperate plan. A desperate plan that actually worked, Theo reminded himself, marveling. He was well, very well, considering what was coming. We talked about what happened. He asked me to tell him stories about my world. Coathook was looking down again. I would like to hear those stories someday, but I won't be here to tell them, Theo thought. Out loud, he said, I hope I get the chance to do it. Did you know him? Not well, only from a distance, but he was important to me in a way. He was my father. Theo could not reply immediately. You don't mean he was like your spiritual father, do you? He said at last. Coathook slowly shook his head. The swing of his long nose as he did so should have been grotesque, even comical, but it only reminded Theo of the strange world in which he found himself, where there was so much he still did not understand. He fathered me on my mother in the usual way. My God, and you only knew him from a distance? Didn't you talk to him? Did he know? I do not think he knew, although once or twice he looked at me as though something about me troubled him. But I was only a child of one of his early matings, and so he did not recognize my name. He had never known it. My mother met him at the Goblin Academy. She was driven from her nest in shame when I was born fatherless, and she took refuge in the countryside. He gave an uncomfortable shrug. It does not matter now. He is dead. He is a hero. I am Kothuk. I am not more or less because of him. Theo thought of his own parents, of his lifelong struggle to make sense of himself by making sense of them, to justify himself by making them responsible for all they had done wrong to him or failed to do for him at all. That's it? Don't you care? Of course I care. That is why I wish to hear from you of his last hours. I am on my way to the funeral ceremony, as are all the others of my people who are here, and I wish to think of him in wholeness. But that is all. I am one of them, one of the living, and he is not. Of course I care, but I have always lived my life without him. May outsiders go to the funeral? It is not for you, only goblins. That is why he said his goodbye to you on the bridge last night. An honor, Cumber had called it when Theo did not understand what he meant. Now he did. Did you love him? Coathook threw up his hand, touched his forehead in a gesture Theo did not recognize, but which had the look of ritual. As a son or as another goblin, proud of what he did? Either, I guess. Then, yes. Coathook stood. But today the sun came up again, as it always does. Thank you for your time, Theo. I must leave now. I have to go and eat my father. Theo sat and watched him walk away, the small, dark-furred figure growing smaller and smaller. Even after Coathook had disappeared, Theo still sat in the doorway watching clouds and listening to the noises all around. The three of them looked back at him. Poppy with a look of poorly concealed worry, Cumber curious but reserved, Applecore hiding whatever she was feeling behind one of the world's smallest but most concentrated looks of disdain. I suppose you're wondering why I called you all here, Theo said. Sorry, that's a joke, and it's not a very good one because I actually did call you all here. I'm kind of nervous. He looked down at his hands, clutched together as if both sets of fingers were afraid the other set might sneak off. I have a question I need to ask you, Cumber, about gateways and going back and forth. Cumbersedge nodded. I had a feeling you might be wondering, Theo. The answer is no. There's still no way to come back after you've been here and gone. Undoing the clover effect has been set back years. There was your uncle's way of returning, but nobody else will ever try anything that horrible and dangerous, and the conditions probably won't arise anyway. So again, no. If you leave, you're almost certainly leaving for good. Theo smiled despite himself. That wasn't the question I was going to ask, but thanks. What I was wondering is, can people from the other side, from my old world, the mortal world, still come over here? And can they leave again afterward? Cumber looked surprised. It took him a moment to respond. You mean, are things still the same that way too? Yes, I suppose so. We haven't had any visitors from there since everything happened, and you'd still have to get someone with an available trip to go fetch them. But yeah, I think so. How about you, Cumber? You've always wanted to visit the mortal world. Applecore's used up her exemption, but you haven't. Maybe you could take the trip. A short one, since I'm sure you wouldn't want to be away from Core very long. He gave the sprite a mocking look as he emphasized the nickname, then turned back to Cumber. But enough to see a few things firsthand that you've only ever read about. It wouldn't have to be right away. Cumber looked at Applecore, then at Theo. But why? Because I have a friend back there named Johnny, just about the only real friend I had, who deserves to see this place. He would get a kick out of it like you wouldn't believe. He'd love goblin drumming, too. And if I can have that one friend come for an extended visit, he might even want to stay, who knows? Maybe we could fix him up with Dolly the Ogre. Then I think I won't really miss my old world all that much. It was Poppy who understood first, but that was because it meant more to her. You mean you're going to stay? Unless you're really, really hot to see the Golden Gate Bridge and visit Chinatown. Yeah. Maybe someday Cumber and his science buddies will find out a way to solve the back and forth thing, then we can go live there for a while. It actually would be fun to show you around. But I've been thinking about it all day, and I realize that I don't have that much left to do back there. My unfinished business is here, learning about my fairy family, learning about the world itself, keeping an eye on old friends and acquaintances, not to mention learning more about who and what I really am. And there's a ton of music I still need to hear. I bet there's even Farisher music, right? Cumber laughed. Sort of, if you like that sort of thing. A lot of it's about farming and sweeping. I'll probably love it. And there's probably even wilder stuff I need to hear. Giant music. Ocean bottom living weird-ass nymph music. All of it waiting for me. What does my old world have to offer that's better? No, I realized I'd be going back just as a sort of, I don't know, way of living up to what my parents wanted. You can make it, Theo. You can make something of yourself. But I have made something of myself. I've just done it here. And I have to admit, I'm interested to see what's going to happen next in this new world everyone wants to build. Poppy had moved over next to him and had his hand tightly in hers. We'll help, Theo. You and I. We'll help build it. Yeah, maybe we will. If I've learned anything, though, it's that I'm a much better musician than I am anything else. I sure as hell ain't a politician. Applecore chortled. No, you sure as hell are not, boyo. But by far the most important thing is that I have friends here. Real friends. I'll miss some things about my old world. The way the sun looks on the trees in October in California, that's almost as good as anything here. And the fog creeping down the hills and stuff like that. But there aren't a lot of people left that I need who aren't here. He turned and kissed Poppy. She kissed him back, and in the smell of her breath and the scent of her warm skin, he knew that wherever he lived could, with a little luck, become the best of all possible places. With an effort of will, he pulled back at last and looked over, a bit embarrassed, to where Cumber still sat with Applecore on his shoulder. They were both grinning at him. You don't inherit anything, you know, said Cumber, teasing. Just because you stay here, you won't automatically be a hero, and you certainly won't be rich. No Violet family fortune left. It's all gone into Hellebor's assets years ago. And any property of his will probably be confiscated by the new council and sold to help pay for rebuilding. Didn't want it, Theo said happily. All I want is an inheritance from my fairy family is some information. Maybe you could help me with libraries or whatever. As far as money and property, well, I've been living in tents practically since I got here. Why change? He had a sudden thought. There is just one thing I realized I missed, Cumber. If you do go back to my world to fetch Johnny for a visit, do you think you could get me another leather jacket? Oh, and you might as well bring back my motorcycle, too. Cumber Sedge rolled his eyes. It won't work here, Theo. Machinery from the mortal world won't run. No, but it sure will look cool. Applecore had the last word, as usual. You mean like when you walked into the freezer, fella? The four went out under the fierce stars in search of something to eat and drink. None of them had finished mourning, and they all had scars of one kind or another. But even without a word spoken about it, they shared an understanding now. As they walked, Theo suddenly fell quiet. Oh, he said at last. Wow, I just realized something. What? Poppy leaned into him. I couldn't go back to the mortal world anyway. Not until they fix the clover effect thingy. We've all been talking like that's where I came from in the first place, but I didn't. I came from here, when I was a baby. So I've used up my exemption. He turned to Applecore. You weren't leading me away from somewhere when you got me out of that cabin. You were bringing me home. He's right, said Cumber. We didn't think of that. Ah, Applecore smiled. See? Even when I don't know what I'm doing, I know what I'm doing. I'm glad you made your decision before you figured that out, Poppy told him. Home. Theo weighed the word for a moment, then took her arm and began walking again. After a while, he started to sing. Poppy joined him, and their voices blended sweetly until the Farisher and the Sprite chimed in and made it raucous and lovely and silly. I think I get it, Theo decided, watching his friends make each other laugh until they couldn't speak. Applecore almost tumbled out of Cumber's pocket, and Poppy was clinging to Theo so she didn't fall over either. You really can find happily ever after, he thought. You just needed luck. Then it was up to you to make it happen. One day at a time. And that's the end. And time-wise, that worked out better than I thought it would. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes. We're at the end of the story, obviously, although there's many pages. Being that it's a tad book, there's many pages of indexes in here at the end. But I'm not going to read those because they're just that. They're just indexes. But it's funny to me because I've just been working all this last week or so on the indexes for Brothers of the Wind with all the hardworking folks who are helping me out on that, some of whom often are in visiting who are helping out, and they're oftentimes people who visit here either in the Sunday early evening or occasionally this broadcast, those who are in Europe like Ilva. Anyway, but now we are finished. And yes, Anthony had asked a question, eat or meet my father? Yes, and it is in fact eat. Eat, E-A-T. So, although as he said, he hadn't actually met him before, so I guess in a way it was meat also. And yet, in another way, it was meat also. But those are unpleasant jokes at the end of a nice story ending. Anyway, so as we run out of time tonight, I'm going to ask the folks who will be in at 7 p.m. for the next reading whether they want to hear that ending again, because it is the ending. Or if not, I may be reading something else. So you might want to check in. Those of you who are not going to be present, which I assume is most of you, may want to check in with the recorded versions to see if I'm actually reading a new story or something instead. I'm not going to start a new long project, but I might start another story because I think there's a story which has a connection to War of the Flowers that I don't think most of you have heard. I don't think I've read it in the past year while we've been doing these readings. Called The Scissor Hour. And some of you, if you were on the mailing list, you may have gotten access to it via a contest or something that we had on the mailing list. I can't remember. So I'm going to find out if that's around and available, and if so, I might read that Sunday. But then, as I said, it will be available, as these things always are, either on the social media, Facebook, Twitter, where they're, every single one of them is sitting there, or on YouTube, or on tadwilliams.com. And heaven knows where else. Perhaps at your local 7-Eleven and Quick Stop. I don't know. But anyway, until that point, I will just say what I always say, which is thank you so much for joining me. It is such a pleasure to have this set up where I can get a chance to interact with you folks. And also to remind you to please keep taking care of yourselves. We're almost through this pandemic thing. So, those of you who have people around you in need, please help them out, but also take care of yourself. That's super important too. Take care of your friends and loved ones. We're doing our best around here to do just that. And I want you all to be here as I continue reading, because God knows someday I might get it right, and you'll want to be here for that. Anyway, once again, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you one way or the other very soon, either 7 p.m. tonight for those who are in the right time zones, or failing that, I will see you at same time, my time, 2 a.m. next week. So, ciao bambini, and soyez braves, mes gens, and I will see you all soon one way or another. So take